Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us here today at the Miller Center. We're excited to engage with you all in thinking about the past and future of home rule and Dillon's rule here in Virginia. Now, for those of you who do not know, Dillon's rule came into existence in the late 1860s. Just a few years after the country had fought a bitter war over difficult issues of state sovereignty, and Iowa Supreme Court Justice John Dillon tried to define where exactly state authority ends and local authority begins. In order for Dillon's rule to take effect, a state issues a statute which affords local governments powers typically reserved for state governments. These powers are clearly defined and are given with the intention of making more local progress on issues in which the state has a vested interest. But since these statutes afford local government no more power explicitly specified, any attempt to reach further than such legislation may be grounds for the state to reassume that power. It can be limited to one jurisdiction or to all municipalities in a state. So Dillon's rules tend to be strict and offer only limited powers, though certainly more powers than local governments might have had otherwise. Home rule is different. Home rule stems from a different constitutional theory, one stating that local government should not simply be actors on behalf of the state, but ought to have some authority to act as the local government sees fit without having to constantly respond to the state. This local government power, they argue, is enshrined in the Constitution. As such, home rule allows local governments to pass ordinances with a wide discretion. Essentially, Dillon's rule provides exemption for state governments to create laws in an otherwise state legislature-ruled government. Home rule, on the other hand, enables local governments to legislate on a broader array of topics, giving them wider jurisdiction. Here in Virginia, Dillon's rule is in effect, making us one of the few remaining states nationwide that have not adopted some form of home rule. What does that mean for the state of Virginia? And in an era of polarized politics, as demonstrated across the state and country not 2 weeks ago, will home rule be on the rise? The Miller Center is excited today to welcome two groups of expert panelists to probe these topics, as well as the history and future of home rule and Dillon's rule here in Virginia. Before I get started, I want to extend my thanks on behalf of the Miller Center to those who have made today's event possible. Thank you so much to the Local Solutions Support Center and to UVA's Democracy Initiative for partnering with us on this conference. You've been wonderful friends and allies. And a huge thanks to Richard Schrager, who helped design this conference. He is a Miller Center Senior Fellow and is also the Per Bowen Professor of Law and the Martha Lubin Karsh and Bruce A. Karsh Bicentennial Professor of Law at UVA's Law School. And he's on our first panel. We're also lucky to be joined by Daniel Farben, who is currently an Assistant Professor of Law at Boston College Law School. And on this first panel, we're excited to be joined by a near neighbor of mine who lives a few blocks over, the Honorable David Ascano, who's a former House Minority Leader in the Virginia House of Delegates and a former mayor of the city of Charlottesville, as I'm sure many of you local audience members know. Finally, moderating this first conversation is the talented Audrey McFarland, Associate Dean of Faculty Research and Development and the Dean Julius Isaacson Professor of Law at the University of Baltimore School of Law. We're so excited to have all of you here with us today, and I'll now hand it over to Professor McFarland to start our first conversation.
Thank you, Bill. I'm happy to be here with you all. We have a great panel. Our first speaker will be Dan Farben, who will give us a historical background.
Thanks. So I'm thrilled to be here, and I've got some slides that I'll get to in a minute. But I'm going to try to use a short amount of time to sort of lay a backdrop for a story in Virginia that comes from some research that I've done about localism and fights over localism across North and South, mostly before the Civil War, but also during Reconstruction and after. And so I want to say essentially 5 things, so here's what they are. The first is I want to make an argument to you that before the Civil War in Virginia, the best way to understand localism in Virginia and indeed from across most of the South was as an institution deeply entangled with slavery and perhaps, I would argue, the most relevant place where local power was exercised was in many places the plantation. So I'm going to make an argument that localism was entangled with the plantation from the get-go, and that developed something that Virginians and around before the war and then after the war considered to be a Virginian way of life that was invested in a kind of idea of localism that pushed back against a couple different moments of assertions of a more robust local democratic power that was being proposed in Virginia. So I'm going to tell a story of that before the war with Jefferson, and then a story of that after the war in Reconstruction with some carpetbaggers who came south trying to change the organization of local government in Virginia. And then I'm going to tell the story of how that reform during Reconstruction unraveled during the period that we think of as redemption, when white supremacists retook this control over the state government in Virginia, and then sort of propose the ways in which those dynamics, those fights over localism over the course of that story have laid the groundwork for the present dynamics about local power and how localism exists in Virginia and indeed across the South. So, so let me begin. Just the very brief description of localism, the pre-war settlement of localism in Virginia and across the South. And so the way that most people refer to this is the county court system. So local government, by and large, in Virginia before the war rested in county courts. And the county courts, the magistrates, the justices of the peace, did most of what we would think of as local government. And so that was the public-facing form of local government. That was what was enshrined in the Constitution. In reality, however, it's important to remember that many thousands of human beings who lived in Virginia before the Civil War were enslaved. They were Black human beings who were enslaved, and for those people, local government happened at the level of the plantation. So plantation owners exercised despotic, feudal control over the lives and well-being of the people who lived on the plantations. And so if we want to understand how governance happened for those thousands of people, we have to understand the plantation as a site of governance, right? As a site, as something like an analog to the town in the north. So if I could bring the slides up, and we'll go to so this is the slide I'm looking at. So here we have two pictures. We have a picture of the plantation. This is the sort of mapping out of the plantation, and next to it we have a picture of the town. Both of these are organized spaces that are designed to sort of govern economic and political life. Now, it's not just for the enslaved people who were governed by the plantation. It's also a lot of the white folks who didn't own slaves existed in a sort of quasi-feudal orbit of the plantations, because the plantations, at least in the Piedmont and the Tidewater areas, were the centers of political and economic power. And so that organization of economic and political power manifested itself in the county court system. So the county court system was essentially an oligarchical system run by planter elites to the benefit of their control over their property on the plantation. Right. So if we want to understand what the reality of governance at the local level looked like in Virginia before the Civil War, I think we have to understand it as at least deeply invested in a form of plantation governance or oligarchical elite governance that was not committed to a broad dispersal of power. Now, how can I say that given the Jefferson, et cetera? So here's how. This is point two, is that the first intervention against this sort of oligarchical set of model of local governance in Virginia came from Jefferson himself. At the turn of the 19th century, he proposed famously a system of government. He proposed to reorganize the Virginian local government on the model of the New England town. We call these ward republics. And Jefferson proposed this with his famous idea of the yeoman Virginian farmer in mind. He was thinking about people in the mountains in what would become West Virginia. He had support from people in the mountains in what would become West Virginia, in places where the plantation economy and power was less prevalent, but he got pushback on this idea at every step of the way. John Marshall famously called it a terrible idea. He said the people can't govern themselves. John Randolph has this great quote that I'll just read to you. He said, if the Jeffersonians should succeed in introducing the newest theoretical, pure, defecated Jacobinism into this Commonwealth, it would inflict a deeper wound on Republican government than has been ever experienced before. Right? So we have an initial desire to break up this oligarchical formation on behalf of white yeoman farmers that meets resistance in the form of planter elites. That's the prelude. So what we have now is the county courts and plantation as the way of life, the way of governance in the South. Then we get the Civil War. And the Civil War, and more importantly, emancipation, is a massive disruption of this way of life, right? Because remember, there are thousands of people, enslaved people, who are being governed through this mode of governance. And now with emancipation, we have to imagine a new way of governing, a new way of organizing ourselves, not just at the state level and the national level, but most sort of exigently at the local level. And that means that we need to reimagine local government for the South and Virginia, across the South. And one thing that happens, and the thing that I've written about, is a set of Northerners come South. And these Northerners say the way to reorganize local government, the way to renovate, so we can go to the next slide. The way to renovate the South, the way to fix the South's broken political system, is to completely renovate it and inject local power, inject the town hall system of local government. So we'll go to the next slide now. So a group of people come south. These are the carpetbaggers, the famous carpetbaggers. In Virginia, maybe the most prominent person to talk about is a man named Edward Daniels. And Edward Daniels was he came south from Wisconsin. He believed deeply that the town form of government was the way to fix Virginian government. And he had a lot of influence within the Republican Party as they were drafting the Reconstruction Constitution in Virginia. And to make a long story short, Jefferson's old proposal for ward republics gets renovated and put into the new Virginia Reconstruction Constitution under the influence of radical Northern Republicans and a bunch of Unionist Republicans who were Native Virginians, but were sympathetic with these ideas. And the basic idea was, so we go to the next slide, is you're going to take a county. This is a county in North Carolina where I did a lot of this research, but you can imagine a county in Virginia. Take a county with the courthouse in the middle, and then the next slide, sorry, go back one. You draw lines through the county and create towns within the county. And so instead of having county government, you have town government with town hall meetings, and everybody is engaged in these new governments. Newly enfranchised Black citizens and the old white citizens, we're going to force people into messy self-government with each other. It's a very Tocquevillian idea. And that would renovate Virginian political economy, essentially, forcing people into a new way of understanding their politics, a new way of understanding local power. So for the radical Republicans, this was their way of fixing the problem, solving the problem of localism, building a new politics and getting rid of the old way of life and building a new way of life that would include freed slaves. But of course, we know the story in Virginia is that soon after Reconstruction, soon after the Reconstruction Constitution, a movement in large part spearheaded by white elites and motivated by explicit claims of white supremacy. This is not me naming it white supremacy. These people called themselves white supremacists, moved to do what they call redeem state government in Virginia. So we go to the next slide. And so what they saw was these new towns people were getting elected. There was a promise that Black magistrates would get elected, Black sheriffs would get elected. And they motivated racial anxieties about Negro rule. This is a political cartoon from the era, right? And I just think it shows you the fear that was motivated there. And so what happened with that fear? So this is where I'll close. I know I'm running out of time. So what happens with that fear when we're talking about localism in Virginia? What happens is those new, we can move off this slide. It's a disturbing image. I'd rather not look at it anymore. So the fear, what happens is that those new boundaries are erased. Because once the white supremacists retake power at the state level, they no longer want that much democracy at the local level. But it's not just that. There's an anxiety not just about democracy in the towns. The towns have disappeared. We've reverted to counties. They've also pulled back democratic control over the counties and centralized a lot of decision-making over county policy at the state level where they have power, right? And so, and it's not only that, they've also decided to shrink all government services. There's this thing, a movement called retrenchment, essentially, where governments across the South tried to just gut government services because they were afraid that there was going to be too much democratic power from the ground level trying to do stuff to help people to disrupt what they considered to be the old way of life, which, remember, was private control over culture, politics, and economy at the elite planter level. So in order to reinstate the old way of life, you had to gut local power and centralize local power to the place so that the state, at the state level where the white supremacists had control, they could make sure that there wasn't a surfeit of democracy coming from the local level, right? So this brings us to the end of the 19th century, and here's where I'll close. I think there's a lot of research work to be done still about the ways in which this movement, as a reaction to Black power, a movement of white supremacists as a reaction to Black power to retake control of state government, which is the precursor to the Jim Crow order, where almost all Black voters are disfranchised, and so you can reinstate some degree of democratic control when you've essentially made the electorate entirely white. This movement is a parallel move to what's happening with Dillon's rule in many places in the North. But they're both centralizing moves that deeply distrust local power, because local power is being wielded by people who are in opposition to the interests and the nostalgia of those who are in power. So I'll stop there, and I'll be happy to talk about any of this further in the discussion. You're muted, Audrey, I think.
I'm sorry about that. I said very profound things. Thank you for Dan for that grounding of this conversation in the history of slavery and what structural racism means. Next, we'll hear from Rich, who will bring us a little bit more up to date about the origins of Dillon's rule in Virginia.
Well, thanks, Audrey. This is terrific, and I'm gonna take up a little bit where Dan has left off. I've learned a tremendous amount from Dan's research for across the region, the whole South, and the nature of localism in Virginia, especially. And so that knowledge and learning has been revolutionary in my eyes. So I want to thank him for doing that groundbreaking work. I came to this as a local government law scholar and as a scholar of cities, interested in why Virginia has never really adopted a home rule provision in their constitution, or statutory home rule, which is something the Commonwealth could do as well. And it's a little puzzling because many states in the 20th century, once we get into the 20th century, do adopt home rule provisions in the progressive era, and then later in the 50s, 60s, and 1970s. And they do it because of urbanization and the development of larger cities and the development of more populous places, and the needs of those places to actually act without having to go back to the General Assembly every time to get permission. And this just seems like a very reasonable and commonplace thing to do. And many states, in fact, most, have adopted some form of home rule in a variant of home rule. They differ from state to state, but Virginia doesn't. And I want to talk a little bit about that. Why doesn't the drafters of constitutions or the amenders of constitutions in the Commonwealth adopt home rule? So that's my question. What it points to is sort of our most recent dramatic constitutional revision, which takes place in 1971. That's a revision of the 1902 Constitution, which basically has some revisions in between those 71 or about 70 years, but not very many. And that 1902 Constitution you could characterize as a Jim Crow Constitution. It is explicitly designed to disenfranchise and separate ex-slaves from the white population and eliminate their power at all levels of government. So in looking at the 1971 Constitution, what we find is that the Commission on Constitutional Revision and my colleague Dick Howard over at the law school was instrumental in this effort, that they did include a home rule provision. And I'll read it to you because I think it's so simple. It's useful just to hear the language of it. Here's what it said. It says that, quote, a charter county or a city may exercise any power or perform any function which is not denied to it by this Constitution, by its charter, or by laws enacted by the General Assembly. Now that's just really one sentence that what it does is it grants local governments the power of initiative, which is to say they can exercise all the powers that any legislature can exercise as long as the state doesn't tell them they can't. That is, they can go out and do the things that they need to do for their populace, for their citizens, what they feel they should do to be a form of responsive government. That doesn't give them any immunity, and this is an important distinction from the state coming in and saying, no, you shouldn't do this, but it means that the state would have to act. That was an uncontroversial proposition, at least among the commission members in the 1971 proposed revision. But it failed. It failed, and as Dan has pointed out, though it failed in the same way that Jefferson's proposal for wards failed in the 1830s, right? Jefferson had also proposed a more robust town system or local government system, a township system, if you will, and there was resistance to that. And so we have to ask why in 1971 it fails. In 1830 it fails. We're not in the same world, obviously. There is a different world, but I want to suggest a few things. So before I do, though, I want to say something about Dillon's rule, which Bill talked about very eloquently and described very accurately. Remember that Dillon's rule is not a constitutional provision. What Dillon's rule is a mode of statutory interpretation adopted by the Supreme Court of Virginia. It was actually adopted by lots of courts all over the country. John Dillon promoted this through his scholarly work and as a judge. There was a competing view offered by another scholar and judge named Thomas Cooley, and that was this idea that there was an inherent right to local self-government. Dillon won out in part because people who were worried about reforming government, and especially worried about developing good government in the progressive area, were worried that local governments were captured by corporate interests. They wouldn't call them corporate interests, they would call them railroads. And the local governments were giving away the store to railroads, other franchisees, etc. And so Dillon was a progressive in a way, which is to say, he was saying, we've got to stop the giveaways at the local level. There was concern about corruption. There was concern about favoritism. And so Dillon's rule is a rule of construction that says any grant of power that is given by the state legislature shall be strictly construed. Now, there are general grants of power that the Virginia Assembly has granted to local governments in Virginia, and those are construed as they are, often quite broadly. But what this means, really, Dillon's rule in the Commonwealth, is that local governments are nervous about exercising any powers that are not explicitly granted, and nervous even to expand even a little bit, the general grants, use the general grants of power to expand their own authority. And so they are chilled or prevented from doing this by an ethos of Dillon's rule and by the worry that they will be taken to court and that the Supreme Court of Virginia will strike down any innovative or what seem to be exceptional exercises of power that they engage in. All right, so why is this simple one sentence grant of home rule, which would basically overturn Dillon's rule, why is it rejected in 1971? Well, it's not exactly clear, but there is something of a Virginia way that continues to, I think, cast a long shadow. One is a kind of fear of change. Another is a fear that the General Assembly, once they gave this kind of general grant, would start to restrict local powers in specific ways. There's this kind of worry maybe about retaliation of a certain kind. And then there was a sense that the local governments are treated fairly well by the General Assembly, so we don't need to mess with our existing system. Now, I want to remind everyone that right prior to the 71 revisions, we have this 1902 Jim Crow Constitution, and we have the Byrd machine exercising lots of power in the prior, half century in Virginia. And the Byrd machine is obviously Harry Byrd, the senator from Virginia, the architect of massive resistance. The Byrd machine operates through the county court systems that Dan was talking about that have existed forever in Virginia, and likes to have power centralized in both Harry Byrd and his minions, but also and therefore in Richmond, and therefore in a machine system that doesn't want to allow very much local power. So there is that shadow. Now the revisionists are trying to revise the Jim Crow Constitution of 1902. So home rule seems to fit in very naturally with a revisionist constitution that's more progressive and that rejects the Byrd machine and massive resistance. But nevertheless, there's kind of a holdover of this view. I think also shifting demographics in the 60s and 70s play a role. There's increased Black populations in places like Richmond and Norfolk and Virginia Beach, and these areas and cities are growing. And there is frankly worry by white citizens that Black citizens will become the dominant majorities in these places. Certainly that's occurring in Richmond. It results in a lawsuit over annexation fights, which we can talk about a little bit. Many of you who've been around for some time in Virginia understand these annexation fights. They're all about race and whether the white vote will be diluted in certain cases. And that's really a concern for many white citizens. There's also, I think, probably a background concern that majority Black cities will start to exercise powers like home rule powers that might concern folks. So I think there's a number of trends happening here. And that 1971 constitutional proposal, that revision in the 1971 Constitution, never makes it in there. Now, what happens after that? Well, people are still hungry for home rule, especially in urbanizing Northern Virginia and other places, Charlottesville, for example. So there are commissions in 1975, in 1978, in 1980, and in 1992, there are commissions, all of which advocate some form of revision, sometimes to reverse Dillon's rule and sometimes to simply amend it or correct it in various ways. We're in another moment, I think, following all those proposed revisions, in which maybe there's some interest in re-looking at this yet again. And so that brings us up to date. And so here we are again talking about home rule in the Commonwealth against a long backdrop that Dan started with, and I've continued of a history of debates and conflict over interstate local relations. Thanks.
Thanks, Rich. You've given us a good grounding in some of the obstacles to fully decentralized power and the favoring of centralized power. So in order to think about how we face these obstacles, we're going to hear from the Honorable David Ascano, who's going to tell us a little bit about what it's really like to live with Dillon's rule on the local level.
Good morning. It's great to be with you, and I enjoyed the earlier presentations. You know, this debate about Dillon's rule, home rule, and another concept, which we haven't mentioned yet, but I think in some ways it's maybe the most important, and that's the notion of state preemption. Just hold that in your head for a while because we're going to come back to it. This whole debate is really part of the American story from the beginning. You know, you find it in the debates about federalism. You find it in the debates about state and local government. And there's an intellectual artifice to this that finds its place at the constitutions. But there are very practical issues here too. And as somebody who spent 12 years in local government and 14 years in state government, to paraphrase Judy Collins, I've seen it from both sides now. So, you know, it's really different when you're sitting in a city council chair or a supervisor's chair. And I have some slides I'm going to put up. So if we can put up the first one. Okay, so there is the beautiful Jefferson's Capitol in Richmond. But who are we talking about today? Let's go to slide number 2. John Dillon. Okay, so just to get some sense of what this guy looks like, you could see these pictures. You know, number 1 is not John Dillon. This second guy, well, he has a beard. He was in the 1880s, 1860s. It might be John Dillon. And can we have the next slide? Now, this is actually John Dillon. And the other guy with the beard is, next slide, the guy on the Smith Brothers cough drops box. So, you know, I got to keep it in context here and have a little fun along the way. So let's have the next slide. Okay, so I think if we all were honest, we would say that there are elements of home rule that we might not like if it came into play. And so I'm looking at things like the so-called Second Amendment sanctuary movement, where counties in Virginia and all over the country have tried to assert that their sheriffs are not simply constitutional officers, but constitutional interpreters, i.e. they can determine what the Constitution means vis-a-vis gun regulations. And home rule in that context is something, you know, that we might not like. Now, if you're in local government, you love the idea of railing against Dillon's rule. In fact, that's part of what you do all the time, because you can always explain things that you don't do at local government by saying, well, the state won't let us do that. And Rich talked about pushing the envelope. When I was on the city council, we faced this debate about whether we could divest ourselves and our pension funds from companies who did business in South Africa. And some people were saying, no, you can't do that. The state prevents it. But we did it anyway, and we never got sued. And we were the first city in the South to actually do that in the 1990s, which was pretty amazing. So when you're in local government, you rail against the Dillon rule. When you're in state government, you still sometimes rail against the Dillon rule. In fact, everybody who runs for office has to always just say, look, the Dillon rule is terrible. We need to go to home rule. But if you were to push the General Assembly members about Dillon's rule versus home rule, most of them wouldn't be able to tell you exactly what it means. And in my 14 years in the General Assembly, I have never seen a full frontal assault on the Dillon's rule through any kind of proposed legislation or a constitution. Now, Rich said that Dillon's rule is a means of construction of constitutional and statutory provisions. We actually have similar provisions in the Constitution in Virginia, which says the authority of the General Assembly shall extend to all subjects of legislation not forbidden or restricted. So it is in the Constitution and it is in the case law, and that's what makes it so difficult for local governments to exercise independent authority in certain sections. Next slide. Okay, so let's get into the weeds here a little bit. Let's get into the nitty-gritty of how this comes at you from a state governmental perspective. I use weeds because this was a big issue in the General Assembly. I know You know, we've talked about a lot of big issues here, but weeds was a big issue because when I was there, every year, an individual county would bring a measure designed to provide enabling legislation that allowed the county specifically to cut weeds in order to protect public safety. Now, you wouldn't think that the cutting of weeds would be something that was a state power, but it was. And we would enact these things time after time. We'd always say yes. It always made perfect sense to give that authority to Bedford or Accomack or whatever county it was. And then finally, after about 6 or 7 years of these individual grants, we passed a law saying any locality could do this. But you see this all the time with enabling legislation in Virginia, where a city or a town or a county comes before the assembly and asks for permission to do something, and oftentimes re-grant it. So let's give you a couple examples. Slide next. Okay, transient occupancy taxes. Every year, counties have to come to the General Assembly if they want to impose a tax on people staying in the hotels. Now, for the most part, these pass, but when I was in the General Assembly, the Republicans controlled it, and there were so many Grover Norquist type people who didn't want to adopt tax increases that they would uniformly vote against these bills. And most of them required 67 votes, a supermajority, to get passed. So you had this, this negotiating to try to get that 67th vote and to allow those people who want to be consistent in never voting for a tax increase to vote no. Most of these things got passed, but it was one by one by one. Now, cities have the ability to do this in Virginia without going to the General Assembly, but counties don't. And that's one thing that happens every year. Now, maybe we'll give counties, I'm not there anymore, but maybe they will give counties the ability to do this across the board. But it probably won't be through an attack on the Dillon rule, but instead through enabling legislation that just gives the grant. Okay, next one. Next slide, please. And then, of course, we come to this. You've seen this all over the place. And this has to do with a state law that preempts explicitly localities from doing something. Let's do the next slide. Oh, it's in the statute. It says, this is the statute that me and a number of other people tried to get rid of in order for Charlottesville to be able to do something with that statute you just saw in the slide. And we tried all kinds of crazy ways to get rid of this. We even created a carve out for Charlottesville. That didn't work. We tried all kinds of things. Eventually it passed in 2020. See what happens when I retire, everything starts to happen. And they were able to pass this new statute, which allows this, I guess it says, notwithstanding this statute, you can do anything you want. Okay, next statute, next to slide. Yeah, and again, this is all about states explicitly preempting local governments from doing something. And sometimes you forget about this, but even in home rule jurisdictions, and we'll talk about this in a minute, the worry is always that the state is going to come in and preempt something that a locality may want to do or is doing. So let's look at this, a well-armed militia. This is a scene from Charlottesville, August 2017. This is a militia that is not a state militia. These are guys who came in from out of state, presumably to protect law and order. Having these guns was not a very comforting sight to see. But let's go to the next statute, next slide. Here you have it. It's in the statute, stupid. Yeah, no locality shall adopt or enforce any ordinance in order to prevent the governing the purchase of possession, transfer, etc. of firearms. So that's what got us in August 7, 2017 we couldn't keep these people off the street. Now it has changed. And I think I've got another slide here that shows where it has changed now. No, this is for later. But so I and a number of other people tried to change that previous statute to explicitly give the authority to local governments to regulate this. We failed. But then again, 2020 rolls around, you have a change in control in the General Assembly, and now this statute has been modified to give local authorities the ability to regulate these kind of firearms. It used to be there were carve-outs for, I think, 11 localities in Virginia that allowed them to adopt provisions that could regulate firearms in this way. Alexandria, Arlington. We tried to get Charlottesville inserted, that failed also. So it's hard sometimes to change laws. Okay, next slide. The biggest thing that's going on right now in the country has to do with COVID and the attempt by states to preempt local abilities to local government abilities to impose certain regulations on their localities for public safety purposes. Two prominent examples recently come out of Georgia and Texas, where you have, and Texas, of course, has some modification of home rule, and where you have localities like Atlanta, Austin, Dallas, taking certain actions in response to COVID that are being denied then by the governor or the state legislature. And you've seen this not just in southern states, but also in northern states. Massachusetts, for example, in Boston, the mayor tried to enact certain provisions, and then the governor issued an executive order that explicitly prevented him from doing that. So it's not just a function of southern states, but you're seeing it more prominently in red states trying to combat the initiatives of blue cities. Greg Abbott, who's the governor of Texas, recently said that maybe we ought to just preempt everything from the state level and not grant cities or counties any local authority. And so this is what's setting up for the next big fight, I think, is this whole issue of preemption, especially when you have blue enclaves in red states, and the red states don't want to give up, the red state legislators do not want to give up their power. So we can go eventually to some discussions of what, if anything, you can do in Virginia to change all of this. And into the discussion, hopefully we'll have a chance to discuss that. The National League of Cities, if you go on its site, has a whole booklet about changes that can be enacted in the states to deal with the hope that localities can get more control over the or the rules that affect their constituents. So thanks very much. I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks, David. That was great. Okay, so we have a few minutes to fix the problem of how to allocate the proper amount of control at the local level and state oversight. So is there any way to fix this? Thoughts from the panelists?
I have one thought. Now, I don't know how it actually would work, how we would do it in Virginia, because you've got Dillon rule provisions and preemption provisions all over the Virginia Code. So to take them all out would be a major undertaking. And for everything you try to take out, you sort of implicate a constituency who doesn't want to take it out. So that makes it very difficult without some kind of constitutional amendment. Now, you could try to put a constitutional amendment in. That's not an easy process either, as most people understand in Virginia. To pass a constitutional amendment means that the legislature has to approve the language of the amendment in 2 successive legislative sessions separated by a state election. And then it goes on the ballot for the state, for the citizens to approve. We just had this with the redistricting amendment that was approved, I think 65-35 or 66-34 pretty dramatic vote in favor of that amendment, but it is not easy to do. And you could put something along the lines of requiring explicit state preemption in order for a city or county to be precluded. That would put the burden on the state, and then there would be all kinds of, I think, proposals to preempt this or that or the other thing. So you'd have to be really careful on how you're doing it, but that would be one thing you could do to change the whole dynamic and sort of flip the burden. I don't know about the rest of the panelists. You know, you guys are the constitutional scholars. I'm just a small town country lawyer. And so I'll leave it to you to how you do it, but it wouldn't be an easy task in Virginia.
All right, so it wouldn't be an easy task. So we kind of need to figure out why would we want to do it?
So I would just jump in and say, you know, David's being modest, obviously. He's the guy who knows all about this, as he says, from both sides. And I trust him completely on this. You know, I think a step in the right direction, you could do a form of statutory home rule. So, and it wouldn't be necessary to go through the whole code, but you could basically instruct the courts that there's a general enabling statute that grants authority. Take the language from the 1971 proposed constitution, adopt it as statute. And to me, that goes a long way, because what you see, and David pointed this out quite clearly, is local governments both hate Dillon's rule and love it. And they hate it because it restricts their authority to do stuff that the citizens want them to do, or that they want to do, in terms of adopting policies like gun control or taking down monuments or taxes or cutting down weeds. But they also kind of rely on it in the way David said, because they can say, oh, we can't do that thing you constituents want, or you special interest group want, because we don't have the authority to do it. Oh, Dillon's rule. And the city attorney sits at the city council meeting and agrees, like, I don't know, Dillon's rule is pretty strong here. You are going to, and rightly so, says the city attorney, you're going to invite litigation. And nobody wants to invite litigation. So I think there's not just kind of the explicit authority problem, but there's a political culture problem, which is that you can always kind of, and as David pointed out, a lot of people don't even know what Dillon's rule really is, or what home rule would really entail. So I think we can educate people better about all these things, but also just try to change in a very simple way, which would be a statutory kind of grant that mimics the 1971 proposal. And that changes the dynamic. Now, when a city councilor is asked to do something by a constituent, they can't say, oh, Dillon's rule prevents us from doing that. What they can say is, oh, is there a specific statute that prevents us? That's a problem of preemption. That's a problem, as David points out, all over the country. But they can't revert to a kind of a Dillon's rule excuse.
So can I challenge you a little bit, because these discussions are fascinating to me, and you're the moderator, Audrey, please.
No, we're supposed to have discussion, so
okay.
Please.
So Rich, here's what I want to know from you and maybe the rest of the panel. So let's take two examples where this kind of arrangement could provide a little bit of, your proposal might be a little bit of heartburn. Minimum wage and sanctuary jurisdictions. And I'm talking about gun sanctuary jurisdictions.
Yep.
The minimum wage issue is really interesting from a policy perspective. Should we have the ability, the localities have the ability to set their own minimum wage? I kind of don't like that policy. I think we should have a minimum wage in the state. It should go across the state. I actually think we should have a federal minimum wage, is $15 an hour. But should we allow, if we were to enact what you're suggesting, I think it would allow localities to go ahead and pass a minimum wage, and it sort of flipped the burden. And when I was on the city council and people would come to me with this, I would say, well, first, as a policy issue, I'm not sure it's such a good idea. It'd be great for Charlottesville, but then I'd always punt and say, I can't do it anyway. Right. It was great. It was great to do that. But that question comes up when you start talking about this. And then from the other side, there are, I don't know how many red jurisdictions around in Virginia who would love nothing more but the ability to allow anybody to walk the streets with an AR-15. And, you know, right now they kind of do that because we're no open carry state. Yeah. But would your proposal open up the prospect that we couldn't come in and regulate even if we wanted to as a state? So tell us how that would work.
Yeah, no, you know, again, there's the difference between the initiative power and the immunity. And as you're pointing out, if the state wants to come in and overrule a locality, say with gun control or the minimum wage, the National League of Cities proposal and my proposal would be that they could do it if they meet the burden that you're suggesting. It would just shift the burden.
Right. In other words, express preemption is what.
Yes, exactly. They'd have to be purposeful about it. And frankly, on the minimum wage movement in this country starts at cities who are able to pass them. The evidence on that is that they're successful in reducing poverty and not particularly detrimental in leading to the flight of business and so on. And they pushed, all those local governments pushed state governments, and to some extent it's going to maybe push the federal government to raise their minimum wage. So while if you're an advocate of raising minimum wages for everybody, it seems to me the minimum wage is a great example of how starting locally sparks a movement, sparks experimentation and all of that stuff. And again, if the state wants to come in and explicitly preempt, that's fine. They have to show that that's an important interest that they have and not just preempt willy-nilly. What you mentioned about Texas is the governor wants to just say, you can't regulate anything.
Right.
And that's because they're very hostile to any of these cities, particularly cities preempting. On the guns, that's the same. What we had was state level preemption of regulation of guns, as you totally pointed out. So I'm not, you know, I think you could flip that and have statewide regulation of guns. But what we're seeing is there's some resistance in rural areas. And frankly, to me, allowing the rural areas a little bit more leeway than the urban areas would not necessarily be a terrible thing. There should be statewide regulation of guns, should be nationwide regulation of guns for cross-border purposes and so on. But we're, as Bill pointed out early in the opening, we're a highly polarized society. Sometimes decentralization and federalism, as you mentioned, is a way to maybe dilute some of that polarization.
Can I just jump in one additional thing, slightly out of my lane, because I'm not sort of an expert in Virginia in this sense, but I think another way of thinking about it, I think when you start thinking about specific issues, you start seeing dynamics in the sort of like small bore specific politics of those issues, right? One of the reasons why I think the history is interesting is that's not what Jefferson was fighting about, right? That's not what these folks during Reconstruction were fighting about. They were trying to imagine a different local politics, right? And so one way of thinking about the question about whether to have home rule or not is what kind of politics we want to have with each other at the local level, right? And so it may be that like we can sort of like think about our commitments to those politics at the local level somewhat dissociated from specific policy outcomes that we're committed to or not committed to. But maybe we can't, right? I mean, there's a perfectly reasonable account of federalism that doesn't really exist. It's just a tool to batter your opponents with, right? And maybe that's all that's going on here too. But I do think that at least one of the reasons why some people remain committed sort of like in a sort of almost utopian sense to local power is that there's a belief that it creates a different kind of politics, a different kind of engagement with each other, a different kind of polity, civic life, which can create, which I think, as Rich suggests with minimum wages, right? If you can demonstrate that at the local level, then it can actually radiate upwards and outwards because you have a different politics at the local level than you do at the sort of like national issue-based battering ram level.
And Dan, you've laid out that structural racism shaped all of this. And so can we have this conversation separate and apart from grappling with white supremacy and how that has shaped politics in the United States, but also in Virginia?
So I just don't think you can, right? I mean, I think that you know, one specific way of thinking about this is, you know, Rich talks about the Jim Crow Constitution, the 1902 or is it 1909? I can't remember.
1902, yeah.
The 1902 Constitution. Now that's a horrible document, right? I mean, go back and read that document and just see what a horrible document it is. But it's actually a document that's weirdly built on top of the Reconstruction Constitution, which is actually sort of the refounding of Virginia. There's a Reconstruction Constitution, which does a whole bunch of things like public education that never get undone quite, right? And then you build the Jim Crow Constitution on top of it, and then you have the 1971 Constitution, which is built on top of that one, right? But there's this, all of this the white supremacy lives in these documents, right? And you can't pull it out. You can't take one string out and have it just be a document that sort of exists purely, right? Like those Jim Crow constitutions across the South remain the foundations of law in the South in so many ways, right? And if you like understand those documents in their explicit white supremacy, I think that gives you a beginning of an access to like how to think about white supremacy as part of these structural problems. Right? And that's not to say that the reason why Dillon's rule applies in Virginia is because white supremacy, right? It's just that it's also not the reason why, right? And so we have this complex, deep structural history that we have to get our hands around and sort of come to some sort of common agreement about, or at least some common conversation about, in order to take these next steps with the sort of full picture in mind. Because otherwise you just replicate the same problems over and over again, and you build the same structures on top of the other structures which already have problematic foundations.
Okay, thanks for that. We have one question from the audience. Does the fear by Southern Virginia of the growing power of Northern Virginia create a roadblock to the change of Dillon's rule?
Well, I think it depends on the issue. I think anybody who's looking at what's going on is realizing the locus of power is moving north, and the South, there are people moving away. It's more economically impoverished, and that applies to people of all races who live in those parts of the state. Again, there's not an incredible amount of discussion about the Dillon rule in the General Assembly. What you find is a discussion among Northern Virginia localities about whether counties, which are mostly the powers in Northern Virginia, there aren't major cities in Northern Virginia, whether counties should have powers comparable to cities, and whether they should have taxing authority comparable to cities. In counties in Virginia, they don't really even have the ability to control their transportation infrastructure, because they don't have, well, some of the larger ones now have public works operations, but cities operate their streets, et cetera, through public works that are controlled by cities. VDOT controls a lot of what goes on in counties in Northern Virginia. So there might be some interest in relaxing the Dillon rule to give counties more power, but you just haven't seen much of it yet. And the South doesn't have the rural areas don't have the ability to stop them now. If Northern Virginia wants something, they just have to make a few strategic compromises with people in Richmond and Hampton Roads, and they'll get it. It's different now than it was 20 years ago.
Yeah. I would echo David's point here, which is if you are in Southwest or in rural areas in Virginia, for the foreseeable future, the dominant political energy is going to come from highly populated areas in the north and the coast, and you're going to lose in the General Assembly. So what you would like actually is more local control of your county or your town rather than less. So I think there's a moment here as we switch regimes statewide that there might be cross-cutting interests in having more local control for everybody. And I think David's point about counties is super important, which is counties are quite the powerful actors in local government in Virginia, but they have very few, they're the central actors, but they have very few powers, many less than independent cities that have charters. And particularly when you're talking about taxing authority or transportation or any of these things. And so there's lots of room there, I think, just to give them more authority. And if Northern Virginia counties want to exercise that authority, but a Southwest county doesn't want to, great. Then we're in a win-win situation, it seems to me.
We have another audience question. Can you explain in more detail the difference between express preemption and general preemption?
David, do you want to, being
You're the one that writes more about this than I do.
So express is just and we'll do it very simply. There's some federal law on this. There's state law on this. Express just says that when the General Assembly acts, it has to say in its statute, we're preempting any, and it's just a phrase. This overrides any local laws. There's things like field preemption or implied preemption, in which the courts say, well, the General Assembly adopted a statute and we interpret that statute as preempting the field, or the statute impliedly preempts the field. So local, even if you don't explicitly state it, local governments can't do it anyway. And so it's just one more, if you demand express preemption, it's one more barrier to the state overriding. They have to really be purposeful about it. And that would be the point of requiring express preemption.
How active have the courts been in policing Dillon's rule in Virginia?
Pretty active, right? I teach a class in my local government class it's a Virginia case about inclusionary zoning. The courts have been willing to strike down laws, and in fact so willing that lots of local governments don't try things. In fact, they've been pretty aggressive in the past.
Okay.
Yeah.
Was there another comment, David?
Comment on that. Again, it comes down partly to trust that the legislators have in local governments. I mean, even people who represent counties in Northern Virginia don't always trust their boards of supervisors that they're going to do the right thing. And inclusionary zoning is a perfect example, because people really worry about what happens if a small group of people within a county start insisting on some kind of zoning pattern that is totally out of sync with the way things have worked in that county. And so you get the legislators saying, well, wait a minute here, do we want to give them control over this? Again, it comes back to this thing, and it's been there since the 1860s and 1880s. Do you trust those local governments? And legislators have to feel good about what they're going to give local governments the power to do before they do it.
And how much trust can we have when we simply disagree?
That's always the challenge, right? And the risk is the longer you stay in the legislature, the more you think you know all the answers, which shouldn't be the case, but you get people there who say, yeah, I know all the answers and I don't think you should do this. And so I'm not going to permit you to do it. At some point, you got to sort of give that up and say, if we embrace the concept that local control generally is a better arrangement than control outside of those people who are being controlled, you ought to give up some power to the local governments so they can do what they need to do given the situation they find themselves in.
I think decentralization, federalism of a certain kind can be a solution to polarization, Audrey. And you raise a really challenging issue, which is what everybody wants to win every single thing at the highest level of government. So they just keep going up and up and up. They want Congress to do everything, or they want the president to do everything. And we can't live in a system where there's genuine disagreement about policy if you don't have some kind of differentiation and you can live a little differently in a rural area than you can live in an urban area, for example. And that's an increasing split in our country. One solution to that split is to give those folks a little bit more power, obviously respecting a baseline of rights and a baseline of public services, but give those entities a little bit more power so they can self-govern. Otherwise, there's a lot of frustration with centralization, and then every fight, every presidential election, every congressional race becomes a huge, the stakes become enormous because all the power is being exercised from the top.
I just have just one, I know we're out of time, but just one additional thought about this is that, you know, in Virginia, this is less true, but in North Carolina, where the exact same experiment I described in Reconstruction happened, when you really did create these towns, they really did change politics. People's experience of politics changed because our politics are polarized in part because they're nationalized, right? But we don't have the same polarities when we talk about whether we should build, you know, a development at the end of the street or like where the dump should be sited. We might have similarly like bad ideas about those things. We might still have white supremacy as part of those conversations, right? But they're different kinds of polarities, and so it's not just that you sort of allow sort of off-gassing of like difference by letting people decentralize. You also create different ways that people talk to each other about politics by having real stakes at the local level, which then actually complicates our national polarization, right? So I think that that's the other, I mean, again, you know, this is a utopian view, but I don't think it's a utopian view that should be entirely dismissed. And I think ultimately it's what's driving folks who really believe in home rule. It's more than just we need to get better policies. It's we need to govern ourselves differently in a sort of old Jeffersonian sense.
Mm-hmm.
All right, well, that's an excellent point and an excellent place to end this fantastic panel. I want to thank all of our panelists for their wonderful presentations. We are now going to move on to the next panel, which is going to discuss municipalities in Virginia and their emergency powers. And I'd like to introduce to you Larry Roberts, who will be the moderator for the next panel. He's the director of the Sorensen Institute for Political Leadership at the University of Virginia. So thanks again.
Thank you very much. Appreciate everyone joining us today. And I want to particularly thank the Miller Center and the local Solutions Support Center for providing this opportunity for me to moderate a distinguished group of panelists. I am the director of the Sorensen Institute for Political Leadership. That is part of the Weldon Cooper Center, which has the Virginia Institute of Government and lead SEI to serve local officials, as well as the Commonwealth. So we really appreciate the partnership we have with the Miller Center. Just a little bit about me. I have helped elect many local elected officials as a local party chair. I worked for a governor as counsel to the governor who was previously a local elected official. And I've worked closely with local elected officials across a range of policy issues, most notably budget issues and transportation, funding and planning. Our panel today is made up of mayors. It could easily have been made up of city and county managers or county board of supervisors chairs. But I'm really happy with the group that we have. I would like to acknowledge that there are many local advocacy groups in the Commonwealth. I'm going to leave someone out, I'm sure, but particularly VML, VACO, and Virginia's First Cities. So we have 3 highly regarded mayors. I know 2 of them very well. The third I've gotten to know during this run up to the panel. So I could give very personal introductions, but their staff has given me such outstanding introductions that I'm going to read some of those. Leslie Hager Smith, the mayor of Blacksburg, is a native of Cincinnati, but she's been in Blacksburg since 1982. Her interest in town governance took root during her years as a reporter and columnist for the Roanoke Times. Hager Smith's government work is focused on economic and community development. She lent her hand to creating a business incentive program for downtown revitalization, matching grants for facade improvements and townwide apartment recycling. She also introduced community recycling of CFLs and electronics at downtown businesses, co-founded Blacksburg Summer Solstice Fest, and originated the 16 Frogs Watershed Initiative, which is a public arts tribute with an environmental consciousness. She's a founding member of Sustainable Blacksburg and an energetic advocate for trails and bikeway connections in the region. She initiated council action on legalizing accessory apartments in homes that are owner occupied. This allows homeowners to age in place with a caretaker on site. Hager Smith has served 3 terms as vice mayor and was elected mayor in 2017. So thank you, Mayor Hager Smith.
Thank you.
LeVar Stoney, congratulations on your recent reelection. He made history in 2016 as the youngest mayor ever to serve the city of Richmond. Mayor Stoney grew up in Hampton Roads and was the first in his family to graduate high school and college. Since graduating from James Madison University, he has devoted his career to leadership and public service, served as executive director of the Democratic Party of Virginia and the first African-American secretary of the Commonwealth, the leader of Commonwealth's oldest, most public-facing office. As secretary, he was the driving force behind the restoration of civil and voting rights for returning citizens. Now as mayor, he is committed to building one Richmond, an inclusive, competitive, and equitable city where everyone has the opportunity to succeed, no matter where they come from, what they look like, how they worship, or who they love. Mayor Stoney has focused his efforts on funding the future, making the largest investment in education in a quarter century, supporting an ambitious paving and road improvement plan, and increasing Richmond's municipal equality index score, the most of any city in the nation in a year. Mayor Stoney remains committed to delivering quality city services, eliminating the vestiges of racism, and ensuring high quality of life for all Richmond residents. So thank you, LeVar. And Justin Wilson is the mayor of the city of Alexandria, with a commitment to ensuring every child's opportunity at success, protecting Alexandria's long-term fiscal health, and investing in the infrastructure that improves quality of life. Justin was elected mayor of the city in November 2018. As mayor, he represents the city regionally on the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority and the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments Board of Directors. An experienced community leader, Justin previously served 8 years on the city council prior to his election as mayor, including 3 years as vice mayor. His leadership has led to new investment in schools, transportation, and environmental infrastructure. He's worked to expand early childhood education, address growing student enrollment, accelerate economic growth, advance climate policy, as well as protecting and expanding housing affordability. He served on the State Board of Juvenile Justice. He's employed by Amtrak as a senior director. And as an avid runner, he has completed 8 marathons. So congratulations on that. I'm going to jump right in. Happy to take questions from the audience in the Q&A, and we will intersperse those throughout. I have questions to fill the time if needed, but I also encourage the mayors to each respond to the answers of the other mayors. So I'll ask this first of Mayor Stoney. How's your city's relations with the General Assembly in Richmond, and has that dynamic changed since the change in control of the General Assembly?
Well, first, let me begin, Larry, by first thanking you for moderating this panel, and I'm glad to be joined by 2 of our fabulous mayors across the Commonwealth of Virginia. Also, I want to thank the Miller Center as well for having this discussion about local government's level of government in the United States of America. My relationship with the General Assembly is a little different than those who are here on the panel, because I happen to be the seat of our state capitol, and whether you're Republican or Democrat, we've always tried our best to cultivate a really good relationship with those who may be in power at the time in the General Assembly, or even in the governor's mansion as well. However, you all should know that I'm a devout Democrat, And it always helps to have someone or those in my party who are happen to be leading the Virginia General Assembly and also in the governor's mansion. But for the most part, our relationship has improved because a lot of the members of the General Assembly who now are in those leadership positions understand that Virginia is an urbanizing state, and that the needs of localities like mine, urban centers, have been at times forgotten. So as we continue to build and grow Virginia, I think we get a more sympathetic ear in the General Assembly compared to years past.
Thank you. Mayor Hager-Smith, you're a little farther away from the seat of power than Mayor Stoney, but how has that change in the General Assembly dynamic affected your role?
Our relations have remained very consistent, and we do rely heavily on Delegate Chris Hurst. So we have warm relations. You probably know that locally we don't run on a partisan basis. So we have a 7-person council, and there's no D or R that goes along with our names. But having said that, we do cultivate warm relations as much as we can. And John Edwards is our state senator, and Chris Hurst, our delegate. And we stay in regular contact with them. We make sure that we see them face to face a couple of times a year at least. And we have always had success in carrying, our legislative agenda to them. So I would say that that's remained consistent, and even after this latest election.
So Mayor Wilson, just a slightly different take on that. How does the legislative delegation work with you to determine, what needs to be done to help your city in the General Assembly?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, with all due respect to Mayor Stoney, now that they are meeting virtually, the seat of power is now up here. Both majority leaders are part of the Alexandria delegation, majority leader of the Senate and the House of Delegates. So we see that power up here these days. I think the relationship certainly has changed. I think your previous panel talked about the shifting geography of power, and we've certainly felt that. As I said, both majority leaders are in our delegation representing the city of Alexandria. We have a committee chair in addition to that, and that's an exciting moment. At the same time, I think because of that, there is a recognition that they have to serve the entire Commonwealth, and in some ways, we've heard a lot of got it. We know what you're concerned about, but we have a lot of other constituents around the Commonwealth to address. We have regular meetings with the delegation. I'm in regular contact with all of the members. We're fortunate in some ways by the way they've divided up the districts in the last reapportionment. We're 15.5 square miles. We have 3 members of the Senate that represent some part of the Senate, the city, and we have 2 members of the House of Delegates that represent some part of the city. And many of those don't even, 2 of those don't even live in the city. So, that's actually been great for us because it gives us a broader delegation with broader interests. So I think we've always had a pretty good relationship, but now, now the expectations become a lot higher.
Thank you. You may have heard the previous panel, David Toscano, who served at both levels, pointed out that occasionally local leaders like the Dillon rule to shield them from citizen complaints that they haven't taken care of something and to be able to blame it on the state. But can you, any of you and the others chime in, talk about, are you hearing from residents about things that they would like you to do where you do feel frustrated by not having the local authority to do so?
I guess I'll go ahead. There are half a dozen things that I can think of immediately that we would like to have the local authority to do. I was really interested to hear David talk about that. And I'm sure that there are places where people feel like they'd rather lean on that excuse. I would say candidly, our group of 7 council people really don't have much trouble telling people no. So, Part of that is just your temperament and your appetite for public conversation. But yeah, there are many times when we have been frustrated with things we wanted to get done and don't have the authority to do it.
I wonder if you could give the audience an example of something.
I just happen to have a list.
Okay.
So only very recently we have been given authority in this latest session of the General Assembly to make some useful but modest changes in gun prohibitions at the local level. And I will just, what I think is useful there is I think that's pretty much on everybody's radar. And I'll bet that a lot of localities want to make some small, sensible changes, but I will tell you how it's gone down in Blacksburg. We are in Southwest Virginia. We're the gateway sort of to Southwest Virginia. There are plenty of people, including those on our council, who carry guns, but there is no reason why a person should need one in our town hall. And we have had a history since 2007 of events, town events. Our major festival of the year is Stepping Out, and we have half a dozen others. But gun rights organizations will come to our town, they'll target Blacksburg, and they will show up en masse, open carrying, for the specific purpose of re-traumatizing a population that notably made national headlines in 2007 with the shooting of 32 people and the death of 33. So we have felt, you know, I hate to use the word of the language of victimization, but we have felt targeted, literally and figuratively, by events and by people who would take advantage of that local trauma. And so we have lost no time creating an ordinance, which we haven't yet passed, but likely will. And that would prohibit guns at our town events on public streets, and it would prohibit guns in our town hall. You know, not very edgy, but we haven't had the ability to do that. In a college town where 2/3 of our population are young people between the ages of 18 and 24, there are a lot of things we'd like to accomplish to do with affordable housing. We have a lot of housing for students. We have a hard time protecting and nurturing our neighborhoods for young professionals and families. So there's things we could accomplish there if we had greater powers, if there wasn't such a heavy reliance on the Dillon rule. There are a lot of states and other places where when students begin to rent in residential neighborhoods, they can perform more inspections and they can have regulations, and the town learns who the lessees are in those houses. We can't do any of that. We had a decent inspections program, but it was shot down at the state level. So we have an inspection program now that puts in an inspector in student housing maybe as little as every 3 or 4 years. And it amounts to just finding out, is the battery working in the smoke alarm? And there's not a lot else that it consists of. And that doesn't protect the students either. I'm not wishing to make them an enemy in this. Our COVID response has been superior, but it's because our town charter allowed us to invoke some emergency regulations. So we didn't have to go rummaging around in the state code to make an immediate and useful response. And then an aggravation for our residents lately is the cell tower ordinance, state regulation that went through in 2018. And now, so these cell tower cans are showing up every place. And we've got people complaining about radio frequency and, you know, the look of it and all this kind of thing. So, yeah.
Well, thank you. So I think interpreting what you're saying, you're going from sort of micro issues to the very biggest issues of, you know, responding to a pandemic where you feel frustrations with the lack of local authority. Mayor Stoney, thoughts on what your residents are concerned about that you feel hindered by the Dillon rule?
Yeah, you know, I think I happen to have a community that's very progressive, that they want sensible gun safety laws. We were the first locality in the Commonwealth to actually pass and approve a gun safety law that banned and prohibited weapons in our city hall or on any public property. I had a 9-year-old who was shot and killed in a public park. And we just believed before the General Assembly even were able to actually approve of the legislation, we needed this sort of legislation on the books here and locally. And so we were the first locale to actually pass such legislation. And after July 1, we recently got the powers to actually make it law here in the city of Richmond to prohibit weapons on public property like City Hall, like public parks as well. But most recently, we've become the center, a gathering point for those individuals who want to, who actually want to continue to spew hate and bigotry and divide us as well, who come to some of our some of these protests armed with weapons, promoting 2A and whatnot. And so we follow suit where places like Charlottesville as well, in terms of banning these sort of weapons at festivals or at these sort of public events, permitted or unpermitted as well. But also we see it in the ability for us to create more affordable housing in the city. I'm a proponent of inclusionary zoning. That's not possible as well. We have to find other ways to bring revenue into the city. 30% of our land is occupied by the Commonwealth of Virginia, whether it's through our local university here, Virginia Commonwealth University, or just state government, period. When 30% of your land is occupied by the state government, that actually soaks up a lot of potential cash and revenue for your city. And so not having other alternatives to bring revenue into Richmond also is a law or a piece of legislation I'd like to see the General Assembly take a look at, because we can't even, if we wanted to, pass a blight tax or a plastic bag tax or whatnot that would create more revenue for the city of Richmond. So there's a number of things I think that the General Assembly could potentially look at that would give Richmond the ability to grow, but also to become even more inclusive and welcoming of the city as well.
Thank you. I'd also like to pose it to Mayor Wilson, and then we have a couple of questions from the audience that I'd like to pose. But just before you go, Mayor Wilson, I was a longtime resident of Arlington before I moved to Richmond and then Charlottesville, and I recall Arlington struggling when they wanted to grant domestic partner rights years ago and not having the state authority to do so. It's been a source of frustration. On the punishment side, Arlington sued about highway construction, and as a result, the legislature would not give them the authority to reinstitute their transient occupancy tax. So state can use levers against localities when they don't like an action that the locality takes. But your thoughts about things that your constituents want that you feel hamstrung by the Dillon rule?
Well, let me be completely honest. I think your suggestion that at times it's a convenient cop-out for local government officials is absolutely true, and it is absolutely true. I can tell you there are certainly times where I have had requests from constituents where I am perfectly happy to be able to say, "Gosh, we would love to put that on the agenda," but that is an issue that you're going to have to discuss with our legislators. Here is their contact information. Please reach out to them and discuss that very important concern that you have raised with them. And it is certainly a convenient way to keep some things off our agenda. And then on the flip side, I think as Mayor Hager-Smith and Mayor Stoney both cited, the expanded local authority that's been promulgated in recent years has put things on our agenda that previously were not. We were, I believe, about 48 seconds after the Richmond did their firearm ordinance, we did ours on public property. And so, we're all similarly taking advantage of some of that authority. We've used it to expand our human rights ordinance. We've used it to obviously, just like Mayor Stoney has, to address issues with statues and Confederate statues in our city. Those are all things that were placed on our agenda because of expanded local authority. I think it's interesting, and Mayor Hager-Smith mentioned this, and again, it's a really interesting moment this year. The response to COVID has been an area where this has been tested a little bit this year. We adopted a mask ordinance a couple months ago, going farther than what the governor had issued in his orders. We used language that we have in our local charter, and we hang our hat on that. But it's a little bit more of an edgy interpretation for us than we would normally take. We normally take a very conservative approach on that. And quite honestly, up until then, we had been content, and I am in constant contact with my counterparts around the region. We had been content to allow the governor's orders to address these concerns. I think we got to a place where we felt like we had to go farther, and we did that. But it is definitely there is some tension there with the authority that we think we have. Mayor Hager-Smith mentioned some of the very same things, that some very micro issues that we deal with as well. In addition to the rental inspection program, vacant building registry was one where we had authority, and actually General Assembly took it away and limited our ability to require vacant properties to register and be accountable to the city for conditions created by those properties. And those are situations where in some cases I don't even know if the General Assembly realizes what they're doing. But it just speaks to the need for some of these, certainly the micro issues, to be addressed locally. I would say, to Mayor Stoney's point, the biggest impact though has got to be on the finance side, and it's not as much of a we want to tax more things, and I know that's kind of the feeling. It's being able to come up with a taxation structure that is accommodates the commercial activity and the residential activity that exists in our communities. I imagine the finances of Blacksburg are very, very different than our finances here in Alexandria. Same thing with the city of Richmond, but we all have the same B-pole structure. We all have the same business personal property, residential or vehicle personal property, and real estate structure, and it's all the same. Our B-pole rates are set by code. We know exactly what the maximum B-pole rate we can have. Never mind the fact that there are B-pole categories that exist in the code that probably don't even exist in the city of Richmond, and we have here in Alexandria. Same thing with Blacksburg. And I think I understand the benefits of having that conformity, but I think the flexibility within that structure is really challenging from a finance perspective, and how we raise and expend revenue for city services.
Just before we leave that, can you just define B-pole?
It's the business professional occupational licensure tax. This is basically the business tax that is paid by pretty much every business in the community. It's a tax that's done on gross receipts in the Commonwealth.
So I'll comment before I ask this next question from the audience, but part of the issue is that there are a lot of legislators who have not served in local office. And so you mentioned unintended consequences. There are times when the General Assembly is not intending to create a headache for localities, that it does through inadvertence at times. Other times it's very deliberate. So Ted Maslin asked a question, and I'm going to frame it a little differently, but he asks why, unlike most other states, are counties separate from cities? Virginia is the only state with independent cities. There are a few independent cities around the country, but in Virginia, we are very unusual in our structure. So he asked why that is. I'm going to switch it a little bit, and someone else will have to answer the history of it. But the question I have is, how, let's say we move from Dillon rule to home rule. What would be the adverse consequences with respect to your need to, if any, with respect to your need to work with surrounding jurisdictions? Is there a problem if they are doing something diametrically opposed to you because the politics of those counties is different than cities, which in Virginia tend to be more progressive? So Mayor Hager-Smith, you want to take a stab at that?
Yeah, I would have to say historically, I got onto council in 2008, and it was at a time when relations were pretty fraught. And it's a fact that Montgomery County is a kind of blue island in a sea of red, but even going smaller, Blacksburg is an even bluer spot in our county. And so historically, there have been what I would characterize more than anything as kind of class distinctions and tensions. Now, in more recent years, we have worked really hard on relations with our county neighbors in Montgomery County and our nearby town of Christiansburg and city of Radford. Those are our closest neighbors. And so I suppose, hadn't really considered that, but I suppose those relations which have grown very effective during our COVID response. We made a regional COVID response through the whole New River Valley, which is 4 counties in a city. I suppose those relations could become more strained if we weren't all harnessed together by our lack of agency.
Can I add, Larry? You've lived here in Richmond, you've lived in Central Virginia, and I would say there are times where, we have a different demographic with a different ideology that lives in the neighboring counties here in Richmond, Chesterfield, and Henrico County. But if you look over the course of the last decade, you can see both counties are urbanizing. Both counties are seeing some of the same aspects that we see here in the city as well, in terms of poverty and also diversity too. But when it comes to safety and health, I think you have to put your locality first. And initially when COVID-19 struck and the pandemic began in mid-March, we had a conversation. We went to the public together with new restrictions that we were going to lead at the beginning of the pandemic. And then after a while, we kind of went down our own paths. Why? Because I serve a different population in Richmond compared to Henrico and Chesterfield. It's blacker and browner, and at times it's also poorer as well. And these are the individuals who are likely to be on the front lines, and also the communities that have been paying a disproportionate price during the pandemic. Now, it's not impossible for a locality to have home rule, city to have home rule, and also work collectively as a region. I think you look at what happens in North Carolina, what's in Tennessee as well, and also Kentucky too, with Louisville. These are localities who, New South cities, you can say, who I wouldn't say mastered it, but they work quite well together. And right now, I look at the way Virginia is set up structurally, and my students don't have access to the schools in Henrico County or the schools in Chesterfield County. And it's almost as if this was done intentionally to keep some of these Black and brown students out of the school districts in the suburbs. And so I do see some benefit. A lot of time, I think here, whether it's the media or just plain naysayers who want to harp on the negativity and the potential for conflict. But let's talk about what the benefits could potentially be if, first, cities like mine had home rule powers, and number two, that localities could work together to provide services like public education to not just the residents and students in the county, but also to the city as well.
Great, thank you. And Mayor Wilson, Northern Virginia does have a history of regional cooperation on a range of issues. Do you see any downside, with city-county relations if you were to be granted more home rule authority?
Yeah. So first of all, I don't see any downside. I'm with Mayor Stoney. I don't think there's any incompatibility between having greater local authority and the ability and the necessity of working regionally. And in Northern Virginia, we have so many, and perhaps unique in the Commonwealth, we have so many structures, particularly around transportation, that bind the jurisdictions together formally that wouldn't even allow it, even if we tried. I mean, we're all serving together in MBTA, MBTC, MBRC, and governing WMATA jointly. These are all structural binds of the region, and it's actually expanding. You know, with Loudoun County entering WMATA very soon, and they'll be adding to the mix. And historically, we've also operated joined at the hip with a lot of home rule jurisdictions in the District of Columbia and suburban Maryland. And so I think we have that experience in this region for a long time. And so regardless of the individual authorities in different places, I think that's going to continue. Now, I will say that even in my time in elected office, the gulf of attitudes and ideologies between the Northern Virginia jurisdictions has narrowed quite a bit. You know, I can say that when I first came on to city council, my first stint was in 2007, and it was in the midst of Prince William County leading what my opinion is characterized as a very hateful kind of anti-immigration effort at the time. And we, on the other hand, in Alexandria, and I know in Arlington, went the other direction in a very a much more welcoming posture at that time, and there was real divides in the region, particularly Prince William and Loudoun, with Fairfax, Alexandria, and Arlington. And that is not the case anymore. And I think it's the growing urbanization of the region. And that's occurred, and I think there's been a changing of kind of sensibilities and ideologies across the region to be much more in conformity, quite honestly, than they ever were in the past. Now, obviously, as the region grows and what was a suburb becomes now more urban, and what was an exurb becomes more suburban, then what now was exurb grows too. So there's still always going to be jurisdictions that are outside of that. But I think the gap is much narrower now, and so I don't think that would be a challenge for us.
Thanks. So I would point out that you mentioned the immigration battles in Prince William. There was a movement to have the state require localities to enter into what were then called 287G agreements with ICE to be local immigration enforcers. You know, that did not come to pass, but that was an example where the localities structurally had the ability to make a decision on their own whether to participate in the 287G program. So that there are times when localities do have shields and swords to you know, enact provisions or prevent provisions. We have a question from Matthew Slatz about the first panel talked a lot about systemic racism and how some of the Dillon rule was used to promote racism in Virginia. He asks about one of the key aspects that he thinks is missing from the conversation is the history of agency of Black communities in response to disinvestment and disenfranchisement, which in ways the Dillon rule discussion reinforces. So he provides a couple of examples of people that have worked to overcome those challenges or have written about it. So he'd like to hear the panel talk about the agency of people in the grassroots level to enact changes with and beyond the status quo of governmental and political institutions. What do you see as limits or opportunities? Anyone want to take a stab at that?
I'll just add that, you know, in this moment of reckoning, and I spoke about it during my recent campaign for re-election, I think localities like Richmond will be judged and assessed on whether or not this moment here in 2020 was a true racial reckoning on where we are 10 years from now. Because if the divides between and the disparities between Black and brown people and white people in Richmond, although the have and have-nots in Richmond remain what they are in 2030, then Richmond and the Commonwealth of Virginia will have missed their moment. And my belief is that localities like Richmond have to have the abilities to we have to have the tools to close those gaps, close those divides. And I see it every day in education, And that's why recently I just spoke about how, my children, my students don't have access to the educational choices in Henrico and Chesterfield, where if you were to go to other localities in the Northeast or even parts of the Mid-Atlantic and some parts of the New South as well, you see it's totally different. But also in terms of funding public education, it goes back to taxation. As Mayor Wilson said, we don't want to tax every other thing, but I also want to make sure I can provide the dollars to create better educational outcomes for my students. And right now, localities like Richmond, particularly the locality that actually is the home to a state government, I feel like we're penalized when 30% of your land is tax exempt because it's occupied by the state government. And I would say as well, that forces us to raise taxes on, let's say, the real estate taxes, the main source of revenue for the city of Richmond, which unfortunately will be a catalyst for pushing people outside of the city, which goes to gentrification as well. And that's why we're proponents of inclusionary zoning that allow us to build more affordable housing in places throughout the city of Richmond, not just in the same areas that were unfortunately redlined in the past. And so there's a number of different opportunities I think that the state government could potentially take up moving forward, but they have to be very serious and intentional, just as intentional as those who created the 1902 Constitution, which we still live with the vestiges of that today. We need to see a General Assembly, a Democratic majority that has that same sort of intentionality, but intentionality for good and for lifting up Black and brown people in our Commonwealth too.
Mayor Hager-Smith, one second, Justin. I had a question that I will tie to this one, which is grassroots activism influencing policy. We had a question about, so-called missing middle housing, and something that really people at the grassroots level have been raising consciousness about and pushing for change. So, how do you see that developing with regard to your state-local relations?
There are several. I think what I have to say about it won't be directly germane to Alexandria or Richmond, but this is the kind of conversation that highlights how particular circumstances can be in a locality. So 2/3 of our population is students, and we accommodate them with a good deal of student housing. So customary practices like inclusionary zoning, which I think is just an excellent, it's a great way to live together. And it's also a great way to plan. It's a clever idea that doesn't necessarily translate to what we set up in a college town, where there are lifestyle conflicts that are inherent in this very, very large population of 18 to 24-year-olds. So something that the town of Blacksburg is pursuing with VML and also with our delegate and our senator is something that would look more like handling proffers different at the local level. So couldn't we accept monies into a land trust that would help to fund affordable housing, because it would keep the land in ownership by the town and or the university? We're actually working on an academic village with the university, hoping that an underlying land trust would help to keep prices down. We've also, we would like to set up a housing trust that would do something similar. These are examples of what we're trying at a local level to address that missing middle. In our college town, which has become a kind of playground for so many people, that's a good thing, it brings in revenue when there's not a pandemic on. But in our college town, the rents and the cost of housing looks inexpensive to somebody who comes from Northern Virginia. So we have a kind of market influence that nothing can touch. It doesn't matter whether we have a Dillon rule or not. We have a lot of people coming in. They will compare the cost of a dormitory and food for 4 years to the cost of, well, heck, I'll just buy a house. And they buy a house. And the students move off the scene and they've still got their house. and then they decide it still looks like a good deal, they'll buy 2 or 3 more. So that kind of influence is affecting our market.
I want to thank Jennifer Little for that question. Mayor Wilson, you had a comment on Mayor Stoney's remarks?
Yeah, and actually, I want to tie it together now with something Mayor Hager-Smith said as well, because I think it's opens up another part of this discussion. First, to the question, you know, I think if you look at the overall part of the overall structure of government in Virginia, not just the Dillon rule, but how we've structured local government, you know, with the exception of Mayor Stoney, because he is a purple unicorn in the Commonwealth of Virginia in being a strong mayor. You know, all of us have a council manager or county board, a form of government, and we do not have an elected executive. And, you know, that is really in direct alignment with what the overall, and I think this question was getting at, the overall tension of Dillon rule versus home rule. You know, our previous speaker, you know, Professor Schrager talked about this gap between citizen preferences and government responsiveness. And, you know, the structure is meant very much to insulate the power from the citizen demands. And sometimes that's okay. You know, sometimes that's a good thing, you know, that you don't have kind of an immediate response to the whims of the day by the public, but it does create that gap, and I think it very much ties to the racial history of the Commonwealth and where the power has been vested. Now, I want to talk about this issue that Mayor Hager-Smith brought up around housing, because I think it's a perfect example of a, particularly right now when you have Democratic majorities in the General Assembly, of how this issue can cut a couple different ways. You know, in a lot of left-leaning states around the country right now, you have movements in the General Assemblies or their legislatures to go the other way on local land use authorities as a progressive policy. You know, you have movements in California and Oregon to take away local land use authority from local governments as a way to create affordable housing, to increase housing supply. And I think the assumption is, like a drunk at the bar, that local governments cannot be trusted to make these decisions in a progressive way. And in some communities, that's probably true. And you know, it's probably true. And I think it very much flavors this conversation, particularly as we talk about housing policy, about where these decisions would be made. Yesterday, I had a long conversation with an unnamed General Assembly member who is working on legislation that would impose land use requirements on local governments around the Commonwealth in the interest of improving affordability. And, you know, I started my conversation with him in saying, you know, let me begin philosophically by saying, I do not think Richmond should be making land use policy for local governments. That is I understand where you are trying to get, but I generally do not think local government, you guys should be making policy. And it's because it creates unintended consequences, because, you know, when you're trying to make land use policy for all these jurisdictions, particularly legislators who have not previously made land use policy because they haven't served in local government, most of them, you know, you make mistakes. And in some jurisdictions, it's going to react differently than others. And so while I may be sympathetic to the goal and maybe sympathetic to the policy aim, it can mess things up. And I think that's the challenge.
Ditto.
Thank you.
Yes, ditto that. Yes.
So Gwen Mason asked if there's a history of localities being sued for ignoring the Dillon rule. Any famous cases? I believe Arlington was sued when they tried to provide domestic partner benefits back in the day. Mayor Stoney, I don't know what the current legal status is, but I know you've you know, been given some headaches about the monuments in Richmond. Is anybody aware of a history of localities being sued? Or Mayor Stoney, would you like to comment? I'll go to Justin first, but then Mayor Stoney just to comment on the current monument situation.
Well, you're right, Larry. I've been sued for the removal of what I believe are racist Confederate monuments off of Monument Avenue here in the city of Richmond and throughout the city. I used my emergency powers to remove those monuments, which we had legal ground to do it. It was the appropriate, legal, and right thing to do. But still, obviously, we were sued for, I guess, not following through on the 30-day requirement and whatnot. But as the emergency management director, I'm able to do that. Went all the way up to the Supreme Court. It's been thrown out and whatnot. But there's still those who are on the opposing side of what I believe on what we should be doing with the monuments. And so I have been at the center of that in the past. Richmond was, I think, a case that went all the way up to the Supreme Court, Croson versus the city of Richmond, in terms of Richmond trying to lead the way in ensuring that we could create set-asides for Black and brown businesses who choose to do business with the city of Richmond, which you're not allowed to actually do set-asides, essentially, for minority businesses in the Commonwealth of Virginia or even in the United States as well, without a disparity study. And so that's also you could say a flashpoint in terms of what localities are able to do to kind of, I think, in providing economic justice and racial justice as well. There have been some serious limitations, and I think the Dillon rule does exactly that. It certainly limits the ability for us to live up to our commitment to empowerment, economic empowerment, and economic justice.
Well, thank you for mentioning Croson, and also Richmond was sued over busing. So there have been many efforts to try to sort of entrench disadvantages that resulted from racist policies. So thank you for that. Mayor Wilson, you had a comment.
Yeah, we were literally just discussing Croson on our dais a couple months ago as we were working to craft our SWAM program. So yeah, absolutely. It's still alive and well today. I can think of two situations where we have gone to court. So the city had, prior to the Commonwealth adopting new legislation last year, we had included gays and lesbians in our human rights ordinance several decades ago, actually, and we treaded lightly as we enforced it because we didn't want to be in a situation where it was invalidated. And we did at some point have an egregious case where we enforced it and ultimately got sued and had to back down on the level of enforcement due to a judge saying we didn't have that authority. We had a Virginia Supreme Court case that related to a subdivision situation where we went all the way to the Virginia Supreme Court and lost because our counsel at the time went farther than the Supreme Court felt like we could in evaluating a subdivision, a very arcane land use decision that came before the council. And so this is not unusual. And I think both Arlington, to your point, Larry, both Arlington and Alexandria have been joined at the hip in the way we've done inclusionary zoning over the years for housing. And both of us have been collectively threatened with litigation from the development community over the years and have had to enter into voluntary agreements with the development community to avoid either litigation or, at the time, legislative action by a much more developer-friendly General Assembly. There's always been a tension there, and it's always been the implied threat. And I think it was mentioned in the earlier panel. A lot of times we don't even try things because we know we're just going to lose. So. Mm-hmm.
So really great audience questions. So I want to thank the audience. We have time for probably one more question if we keep the answers relatively brief, and you all have been great, so that's not a criticism. But can you discuss revenue sources that have not kept up with technology changes? An example from the audience is local taxes on landlines that may not be available on wireless, just the tax structure question more generally.
Take this one, or you guys want to go?
No, go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So a couple areas. So I think the biggest area is around services. The tax structure in Virginia is very much structured around the sale and trade of things, of widgets, of and certainly in Northern Virginia, we have a services-based economy. What drives investment is services, and the taxation structure is just not designed for that. And so the consumption-based parts of our economy have a much more developed, extensive, and arcane taxation structure built around them, and the services just don't. And so I think there's just a lot of need for modernization. Even around the communications example is a perfect example of where the Dillon rule is a struggle. So the General Assembly, I think, did a good thing a couple of years ago where they said, yeah, technology is changing. We got satellite TV now, but yet we still have a cable tax and we have a landline tax and all this. So they created a new communication sales and use tax, sent all the money to Richmond, and said, we're going to divide it up and send it back to you guys based on the allocation that how you were earning the money back when we created the tax a decade and a half ago, which no relevance to where we are today. And again, things are very different in all the different jurisdictions, and we need flexibility to adjust for that. So.
Yeah, and I'll just add to what Mayor Wilson said as well, that we have a revenue stream, the machinery and tools tax, right, for manufacturing, mining, and processing, things of that nature. Richmond at one time was the center for tobacco manufacturing, things of that, but not in 2020. We still have a little manufacturing still left in Richmond, but not very much. While Richmond has changed, like the country has changed, right, and our economy has become more service-based. Why don't we have the ability to use to tax ride sharing, things of that nature, what people use regularly now? That is where I think there's a gap. And if there are any legislators out there listening, I think that there's also an election this year in 2021. What I want to hear candidates talk about is tax reform in general in the Commonwealth of Virginia. We need to have a debate and a discussion on tax reform. I want to obviously have a discussion about the Dillon rule and home rule and local rule, but we need to have a real debate and discussion on taxation in the Commonwealth of Virginia and tax reform. I feel like we're still set in an agrarian time in Virginia, while all these other states are just rolling right past us. In the Mid-Atlantic, in the Northeast, in the Midwest, we have to have a serious discussion about taxation moving forward in the 21st century.
That sounds like a great speech. So I'm going to give the last word to Mayor Hager-Smith on this taxation question. But before you answer, I just want to thank again our audience, the Miller Center, the technical crew that has made this possible, and our panelists for a great conversation. So Mayor Hager-Smith, and then it'll go back to Bill Antholis.
Okay. I admired so much what Mayor Stoney had to say. It would probably be a good thing to leave it there. But I can tell you very quickly and succinctly how much the town of Blacksburg is hurting. So 40% of all our revenues are economically sensitive taxes like B-poll, lodging, and meals. And you can imagine what it looks like right now in the middle of the pandemic. Ordinarily, we would have a 500,000 people come into town and stay in our, eat at the restaurants and stay in our hotels. None of them are coming because football is so truncated. So in the last 6 months, our revenue from restaurants is down 50%, and our revenue from lodging is down 70%. And we have clawed back all of the capital improvements that we had planned for the last half of last year. And we have cut every service and future capital improvements. We've cut everything except fundamental, basic services, and tried to preserve positions in town right now. And we'll come out okay on the other side of it, but we don't know when that's going to be. So we're really hurting.
Well, on that positive note, we'll end it there. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Bill?
Larry, thank you. We are all really lucky to have you leading the Sorensen Institute and having the Institute serve in both helping develop generation after generation of leaders here in Virginia, as well as being a real shining jewel in the Weldon Cooper Center's array of terrific research on economic, demographic, and survey-based research that really serves the Commonwealth. And so, Larry, thank you for joining us today and bringing together such a terrific panel. To mayors Hager-Smith, Mayor Stoney, Mayor Wilson, thank you for joining us. I've been lucky to host in person Mayor Stoney at the center, and so look forward to extending that hospitality in person to our great mayors from Alexandria and Blacksburg. We benefit enormously in the state from your cities, not to mention having students here who come from there. So we're delighted and look forward to having you in person. And it's been great to hear from you and from the first panel on how state and local authorities work well together with the state government or not on issues ranging from economic development, housing, monuments and gun, taxes, and even football. You slipped that one in at the end there, Mayor Hager-Smith, and I appreciated that. Not to mention our long history here in Charlottesville, going back to Thomas Jefferson today, we heard on essential issues in democratic theory, slavery and race, social and economic justice, and even political polarization. So on behalf of the Miller Center, I really want to thank everybody here, particularly starting with Rich Schrager, who got this conversation going with the Local Solutions Support Center, the Democracy Initiative here at UVA, and our own tech and communications team that put on these events. And then finally to the audience, thank you. Judging by the size and quality of the audience, I can look and see who you are. I know so many of you, and I'm delighted to see some names that I don't know, as well as the number and quality of the questions. This was a really great discussion and one that I know will continue. So thank you all so very much, and we look forward to a year better than 2020 and 2021, which is important to so many of us, including statewide elections in Virginia. Here they come again, and look forward to exploring these conversations in the run up to that.